Welcome everybody to our second lecture in our new series, Making Sense of Complexity. This will, as you can see, be a bi-weekly affair for the rest of the semester and continue into the future. What you see here on this screen for your information are the next 4 lectures. After today. So we will have had a grand total of 6 lectures in the first semester of the existence of that series. Hopefully everybody gets the notifications. We are working on solving the issues with distribution lists, which always is a big fight. So if you, for whatever reason, didn't get a direct message, please let us know and we will make sure that that doesn't happen again. So without further ado, let me introduce today's speaker, even though I guess most of you might be very familiar with her, Joffa Applegate, who will be talking about the role of economics, and more precisely complexity economics, in the context of global futures. This is actually a sizable part of our operations within the school and the complexity initiative at large. We are trying to figure out what kind of approaches we need to develop to the economy so that we can better understand the operations of the economy in light of global futures transformation. We have created a complexity economics lab, which has several members, and it's also listed on the GBCI website. And Joffa is a core member and leader of that complexity economics lab. You might also remember that Joffa has a very diverse background that involves academia as well as the real world, and that we are very proud that she is actually one of our own graduates, having gotten a degree in applied math with a focus on complexity, where several of our very own are very responsible in granting that degree to Joffa. So without further ado, Joffa, take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Manfred. I'm very excited to be talking about this topic today. It's very dear to my heart, and I think it's very important. So I'll figure out how to work. There we go. Okay, so I am going to explain what complexity economics is from like kind of how it got started, what people are doing with it now. There's lots of different varieties of it, and it's a term that's been evolving over the last 30 years or so. So I would say that complexity economics probably formally started at Santa Fe Institute about 30 years ago, maybe 35 years ago. And there's some questions going forward about whether or not it's the right term, what it means. People have taken it in a variety of different directions. So we'll kind of summarize those. And then I'd like to talk specifically about what we are doing at the Complexity Economics Lab as far as what projects we're doing, and then summarize with how this could be applied across, or these concepts or these ideas, or as I call it, it's a state of mind, can be applied across all questions within global futures. All right, so I think it's interesting to look at complexity economics in terms of the history, or basically the structure of the other disciplines. So mainly whatever you've got going on at the W.P. Carey School is it's neoclassical economics. That's pretty much what it is. And then there's a lot of these ideas in complexity economics, people have actually thought about them in the past. So you have economists like Veblen or Penrose, Keynes, Hayek, Simon, all the way to Minsky. So all of these individuals have come up with some of these ideas that are common or shared now in complexity economics. And it didn't fit into neoclassical economics. So then you have a whole range of what's called heterodox economic practices or theories or disciplines. So that's behavioral economics all the way to evolutionary economics, institutional economics. But what I think is interesting about this particular presentation, which is put together by a group of kids in Germany called exploringeconomics.org, which has got lots of great stuff on it if you're curious. is that they have defined the whole field of economics in terms of scarcity, uncertainty, dominance, and then change. And then they have mapped the heterodox economic disciplines to these different, kind of broad categories of the types of questions that an economist should be able to answer. And you'll notice that they have a box for complexity economics, which means that one view is that complexity economics is just another version of a heterodox economic discipline that is focusing on uncertainty and change. It's not quite how I see it, and I think many other people would object to that framing as well. But it is one of the ways that complexity economics is placed on the landscape. All right, so what is it? All right, so first of all, as I think I've mentioned, it is different things to different people. And I think that's okay. It's an emerging discipline. It's evolving, it's growing, it's developing. So you would hardly expect that it would be a monolith as far as ideology. So some of those multiple flavors we'll see there's empirical focus, very much data driven. So a lot of machine learning there. Theoretical focus, which is kind of where I land. And then some people are just really love the methods. And so they focus on developing new interesting network measures and things like that. But we'll get into that in a moment. One of the things I can say about complexity economics is that it really does away with disciplinary boundaries. So when you have an economics question, you're not just kind of confining yourself to what would be traditionally considered part of that discipline. You'll pull in politics, you'll pull in biology, you'll pull in whatever you need in order to address the question. And then, of course, it frames economic questions in terms of complexity themes, hence the name. And the primary themes that show up with the economics in particular are emergence, path-dependent evolution, and of course, interconnectedness. All right, so the whole reason we have to do this, we have to move in this way, is that the conventional economics, otherwise known as neoclassical, some people call it traditional, again, nobody even knows what to describe the old way of thinking. It leaves many questions unanswerable, and that's just not unanswered, but unanswerable. And the two main ways that that falls apart is that the neoclassical framework is primarily about equilibrium. And as I believe John Holland is credited with saying, anything that is in equilibrium is dead. So anytime you're looking at a living, evolving system, you rarely are in an equilibrium state. And there's a couple of other issues that come up. Other main ones are the assumption of a rational actor and the idea of the optimization and maximization of something. Okay, so let me give you a couple of examples of problems that are unanswerable. Now, I'll back up just a little bit and say that, Brian Arthur has this idea that you can look at economics questions as falling in two main categories. So you're either talking about allocation or you're talking about formation. So this is allocation of the resources, but then there's also the formation of the regulatory structures and the networks that support that allocation structure. And his point is that conventional neoclassical economics does a pretty good job with the allocation, but they have absolutely nothing to contribute around the formation, because of course, as something is forming, it's not in an equilibrium. So I disagree with that slightly, because I actually think that there's a lot of questions that even have to do with allocation, like prices and wages, which are also unanswerable. So for example, really easy one is how are prices set, okay? This is one of the things that, neoclassical economics is supposed to be very good at determining. So my youngest daughter turned 9 a couple of weeks ago, and for her birthday, we bought her a violin. So we were able to purchase for her a solid wood back violin with a bow, with a spare set of strings, with a chin guard, with a case, shipped from China for $180. So there's something very odd about that pricing regime. And so one of the things that the neoclassical economics does is it keeps, it's very distinct about its boundaries. So there are a whole bunch of institutional arrangements that go into setting that price of $180 for something that 20, 30 years ago would have cost nothing short of $800. Now, another issue is that when you deal with only equilibrium states, what happens if somebody doesn't know the price? How does the price actually get set? So with our Berlin colleagues, we've been putting together a price dynamics model, and it's pretty clear that you need both a learning process that involves error, and you also need money in order to be able to arrive to what would typically be the equilibrium price. So it's a very complicated process, and it's very interesting, but neoclassical doesn't even really tell us much about modern price setting. Another area where we have some significant disconnects or not really able to solve a problem is about how wages are set. So some of you may have seen this graph before, but what it's describing, the light blue line is hourly compensation over time from 1948 to 2018. And the dark blue line is productivity. So productivity is basically your GDP divided by your employment. So productivity has been steadily increasing over this time period, but about 1979, wages stopped tracking with productivity. And there are lots of people who are trying to figure out exactly why this is. It's not globalization, because 1979 was before the big 1990s globalization push. It's not really AI and technology. So what is it that's going on? So there's conversations about, okay, well, the social contract has been broken, or yeah, I mean, earned income tax credit started about right then. So it's still a bit of a mystery, and we'll come back to the labor and the wage setting question, because it's actually one of the projects we're working on. All right, any questions so far?
Nothing in the Q&A yet, so just anybody feel free to ask questions at any time. Joffa has agreed to answer them as you go along.
Yes, so if you want to ask for some clarification, or if you have a question or a challenge, I would love to hear it. All right. Okay, so so we have a situation right now where our current economic theory, the thing that is still being taught in all but one textbook that I'm aware of, basically the business schools around the world are still being taught this neoclassical economics. And it's not up to the task of answering the questions that we are facing now. It's in a way, it's like low-hanging fruit was taken care of in an idealized sort of way. But even the implementations of that theory and the consequences of the ideology that is developed out of the theory have led us to really very unsustainable inequality, and also hitting up against planetary boundaries in a way that's not sustainable either. All right, so complexity economics also employs innovative methods. All right, so we need a new way of thinking about economics so that we can answer these questions. And I think that this has happened and developed in parallel with the increase in our ability, both computationally and through network analysis, to do more things. So these kind of go hand in hand. The need for better answers, the need for better understanding, is running parallel to also our ability to develop better methods. So first of all, agent-based models. Agent-based models are integral, in my opinion, to complexity economics, but they are not complexity economics. So just because you do a model that's agent-based, that's not the end-all be-all for complexity economics, but it is a very primary tool, mainly because complexity economics is looking at emergence and path dependence and interconnectedness. And so kind of by nature, that's what an agent-based model naturally does. But it is not the only method it's used. So I want to touch on kind of one of the early canonical economic agent-based models just briefly, for those of you who aren't familiar with it. All right, so Sugarscape, developed in 1996 by Epstein and Axtell. It's a toy model, which means that it's not trying to actually recreate all aspects of an economy. It's really exploring a basic fundamental interaction so that we can gain some insights. So I'm going to very briefly tell you what the setup is, and then we're going to look at one of the results, and then we're going to talk about why that is relevant. All right, so it's called Sugarscape because you have a landscape which is white and yellow, and on each little square in this landscape you have a pile of sugar, and the patches that have more sugar are colored darker yellow, and the patches with less sugar are very, very pale. Yeah, so you don't really see the yellow at all. And then you have agents that are just randomly scattered over this landscape, and each agent has a certain endowment of sugar. So the settings right now is that endowment is going to be between 5 and 25 time steps worth of sugar. And the way you measure that is that each time step, an agent will consume some of that sugar to stay alive. And if they run out of sugar, they will die. If an agent dies, it is automatically repopulated randomly with a random allocation somewhere else on the landscape. All right, so it's a very simple individual maximizing algorithm. So each time step, an agent will move to the patch that it can see that's within its range that has the most sugar, and then it will go to that patch and it will collect all the sugar that is on that patch. And then the next time step, if it can move, it will move to another patch. And here's what happens. So I think what's important to notice is that wealth distribution was randomly distributed at the very beginning. And you see what's developing is that lots of agents have very little sugar and a very few agents have the most sugar. And you see your Lorenz curve is expanding. But it's also interesting to note that the Lorenz curve is bounded, right? So it's not completely going off the rails as far as, severe inequality. It's kind of bouncing around one particular level. And this is interesting because what this model tells us is that in a just natural state where individuals are just doing maximization decisions, that you will have a level of inequality that will arise. Now, lots of people have taken this model and done many other experiments with this. I think Marco actually has a sugar and spice where you can have trade that starts. And then you can also start playing with other algorithms, like what if you had a more cooperative algorithm? Would you still have this wealth distribution that emerges? So again, you can start with something really basic like this, and then you can ask a bunch of questions and expand it in a variety of different directions. And I know that there's a lot of cooperation work that is going on with Marty and Marco's group and also Michael's group. I think there was a talk earlier this week about cooperation. All right. So another tool or method that is used very heavily in complexity economics is, I'm going to call it fancy network metrics. I don't know if that's the formal term for it, but that's how I think of it. And I'll give you an example of one of those. Okay, so the one I want to talk about specifically is something called the method of reflections. This analysis that I'm going to show you was put together by Hidegel and Hausman. I don't remember exact year. Is on the next slide. All right, so what we're looking at here is we're looking at a bipartite network of countries and products. So you've got 4 countries on the left in orange, and you've got 4 products on the right in blue. And iGraph has arranged the countries in terms of having the least number of crossings. So, country 2 is on top. But anyway, what we can see is that country 1, which is the second from the top, produces 4 products. Country 2 produces 1 product. Got it? So it's just a bipartite network. From that bipartite network, you can create an adjacency matrix where you basically have all of your countries as your rows and all of your products as columns. And if a country produces a product, you would have a 1 in that spot. Once you've done your adjacency matrix with your rows and columns, they've developed this measure called, it's the zeroth reflection. So it's, you've got a 0 notation there. Notice that it's O's, not products. There's a reason for that, but it's not important. It's just O's mean products. So if you sum across the rows, that gives you a diversity measure. That tells you how many products a given country produces. If you sum along the columns, you get your ubiquity measure, which tells you how many countries produce any given product. And then the method of reflections is this constant back and forth between a matrix, an operation where you're multiplying the adjacency matrix times your previous vector, and then you are normalizing it with the diversity in this case, ubiquity in this case. So because this is K0 at the n minus 1, you can take this K0 n minus 1, get a KC n minus 2, plug that back in, and you end up with a matrix formulation for this. Okay, so once you run this, all right, you can run it for however many reflections you want to use. You end up with very interesting diagrams like this. So let me explain what you're looking at. All right, I've turned it on its side so I can make it bigger and you can see it better. All right, so each of these dots represents the value of the reflection for a given country. So Sweden's value of the 0th reflection is right there. And don't forget, the 0th reflection for countries is their diversity. So what you find is that Singapore, Chile, and Pakistan right here all have very similar values in diversity. So each of these, this is the ranking, ordered ranking, highest to lowest of diversity or of the reflection measures. Yeah, that's just the ranking. So it's not giving you the value, it's just giving you the ranking of the measure. And then on this side, you can see the re-ranking after the 18th reflection. So you can see that the reflections are starting to stabilize. And so once you've got once you've got them equal, so the previous reflection equals the next reflection, then you kind of cut it off. So they cut it off at 18. So what you can see now is that Singapore has moved all the way here in the rankings, Chile's here in the ranking, and then Pakistan's even further down here. And the interesting observation is that Singapore, Chile, and Pakistan, while they have nearly the same diversity measure, when it comes to the 18th reflection, this tracks very strongly with GDP. So as n increases, the correlations to population decrease and the correlations to GDP increase. And then the point is that the higher reflections are able to correctly differentiate the income level of countries. Because you're doing this folding with this reflection, folding the information of ubiquity and diversity. It is similar to eigenvector centrality, but I don't think it's directly, and I see Brian's question. Yes, so I do believe that they are related to eigenvector neutrality because you can run this, you don't just have to do the reflections, you can actually find the eigenvector. But I don't think it's saying the exact same thing because you're incorporating two sets of information. Maybe another way to think about it, Brian, would be that this is eigenvector centrality for a bipartite network, if that makes sense. Okay. Yeah, so this was done in 2009, Hidegel and Hausman. They actually did this analysis for all of the countries, and they made a publication, huge, gorgeous publication, which is where I got the network image on the previous two slides, called the Atlas of Economic Complexity. So it's a pretty thorough set of work, and that it's yeah. So this fancy network metric reveals some information about the complexity of an economy and future trajectories. Okay, so those were two examples of what other people have been doing around agent-based, complexity economics, and then just method-wise. So specifically, I'd like to talk a bit about how what we're doing here at ASU with our complexity economics lab. So it's a series of questions. I see there's a question from Eric. Oh, PowerPoint, got it, yeah, okay. Yes, I'm sure it will be. Okay, so in each of these cases, I'm going to motivate the problem and then explain what we're doing. Okay, so this was a report from Reuters, I think 2013, said that over half of US workers employed by fast food restaurants rely on public assistance because their paychecks don't cover basic needs. I first became aware of this. There was a New York Times article probably about the same time where the comment is that when you were hired at a McDonald's, you would receive a bunch of employment information, and at the same time, you would receive an earned income tax credit application form. So obviously, the company was very, very aware that their employees would likely need earned income tax credit. And for me, this was always very obviously a corporate subsidy. Now, I don't know how many people are familiar with the Earned Income Tax Credit program, but it is what Congress has come up with to replace what used to be welfare. And it was the conservatives were very adamant that any sort of dispersal of public funds to support employment or unemployment would need to be tied to work. So basically, if you stop working, you lose your earned income tax credit. So your earned income tax credit tops up your wages, so to speak. So one of the things that we've decided to play with here, again, this also is trying to figure out what's going on with wages not tracking with productivity anymore, is that we've got something going on that is suppressing wages that occurred and started happening before the globalization and the robotics. So the question is we're exploring what could possibly be going on. So Sam Bowles has put together with a bunch of other people a new economics curriculum called CORE. The name of the book is just called The Economy, so it's a little bit hard to look up. But in that book, they have a presentation on how wages are actually determined based on a game theory or a game that an employer and an employee play, where each of them has a best response to the other player's response. So you can find a Nash equilibrium that addresses both players' best response functions, and then there's various thresholds, and the idea is that a worker will there's something called an employment rent, which means that a worker actually gains something that is non-monetary by actually working. They also gain things under the Earned Income Tax Credit program by working that they would lose. So essentially what's happening is that the cost of job loss is greater than just your wage under this program because you are also losing the tax credit. So one of our hypotheses is that we might be able to demonstrate how Earned Income Tax Credit program actually reduces wages and drives wages down. Conversely, you could say that a UBI program would actually increase wages. So so this is it's dynamical equations at this point, but eventually will be agent-based model. So we're working on that one. All right, so that's one of our areas of research. Another one, so Rana Foroohar, if you guys don't know who she is a Financial Times writer, written a couple of books. She's really interesting to listen to, super smart. Says only 15% of all financial activity is tied to the real economy. The remaining 85% describes a closed yet ever expanding cycle until a crash. Okay, so this is an amazing topic for me because I think it is based, I think most people have a fundamental misunderstanding about how the banking system works. So I was talking to some students the other day, and we just did a survey about how they think the banking system works. So I think what's taught in textbooks, well, I know that what is taught in textbooks currently is that if you go to a bank to get a loan, what is actually happening is that the bank is taking deposits that people have put into the bank as savings, and they are packaging them and giving it to you as a loan. This is called Jimmy Stewart banking because in It's a Wonderful Life, Jimmy Stewart explains exactly this to all of his credit union clients who are clamoring to get their money back. He says he can't give them their money because it's in so-and-so's house. All right, but this isn't actually how the banking system works. When you go and get a loan, what the bank does is it automatically creates that money through a credit creation mechanism. It's basically a ledger. They have a ledger. They say, okay, on one side we have a loan, on the other side we just create all of this money. So it's very interesting because this is a very expansive dynamic. And what bounds this dynamic is a time-based payment obligation, because the banks not only do the lending, the banks also run the payments, right? So we get our paychecks, or you said you pay your mortgage, or you pay your rent, or you pay your utilities, and that's actually a transfer of money from one bank to another bank. So the bank needs to be able to make that transfer good. So basically all of these transfers happen at the end of the day. So all of the different transactions are added up, and then the banks settle at the end about who actually knows who, or who actually owes who. So this is where the credit expansion runs into problems, because those banks also need to make these very real, timely, reconciliations on actually payments. So we are building a network of banks where each bank is really represented by a ledger. So the banks are going to be, inflating their ledgers by adding credit. That credit is going to be transferred through the economy via the payment system. And it's been really fun to try to figure out what the boundaries are of this system. So again, this is work done with our colleagues at Global Climate Forum and Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies. All right, next project. And this is a really big one because there's lots of different sub-projects in this. And I think this is where we will distinguish ourselves at ASU in terms of complexity economics. So I'll just give you a little example here, and then we'll talk more about economic development in general. So Paul Krugman, who I believe we all know who that is, a New York Times economics writer, he refers to the horrors of import substitution while calling for a revolution in development theory. So he published this paper in '92, where he's saying we really need to rethink development theory because what we've got isn't working, but we know that import substitution is not going to be part of that solution. Whereas Jane Jacobs, who was a sociologist and writer who studied cities and has written a book called The Economy of Cities, amongst others, her point is that import substitution is the catalyst for growth. And she goes through many examples in that book of why this is true and how this process unfolds. So one of the things we're working on is a model of basically taking Jacob's ideas and operationalizing those, and doing a model of how a toy economy would grow based on import substitution and then export expansion. She has several different dynamics or methods that she describes, and we've come up with a few of our own. So we'll put that together. Yeah, okay, but there's a couple of other things that we're doing in this area as well. So we have a project on regions and cities, the dynamics of regions and cities. So we've been doing some work on looking, so this is using scaling metrics or network metrics, exploring population, GDP, employment numbers, what industries a city has, what occupations are in those industries, what skills are required, and looking for structural similarities and patterns that might lead us to understand a bit more about how industries stack in such a way, how a complexification of an economy happens, what's crucial, what are possible development paths, is there hysteresis in those development paths, which means if you get to a certain point and then there's a crash or a shock or something and you fall back down that path, do you fall back the same way and you go back the same way? All of these are questions that we're exploring. And ultimately, another idea that we have that we're playing with is this, again, it's a structural idea about an economy. And this really relates very closely to what's been going on politically here in the US in particular, which is that I think we could identify that some economies, usually rural, usually smaller, send all of their consumption money. Every time they consume something, that money goes to a city. And you can imagine it this way. So if you are in a small town and the only thing in the town is like a box store at either end of the strip, And yeah, basically it's all changed. Nothing is owned locally for, yeah, any time that somebody in that town or that community spends something, the bulk of that money that they've spent actually exits the city, and it's not there for the economy to use locally. So we have this idea where we're thinking about constructing a network diagram of all of these communities. We call them CBSAs, core-based statistical areas. And they're nice. It's a census designation and a BLS designation. And it's nice because it covers really big cities and it covers smaller cities. And another advantage of this data set is it's not just cities, it's called metropolitan areas, right? So for example, a lot of northern New Jersey is tied in with New York City because they're considered to be the same economy. So these groupings are intended to represent a somewhat distinct, functioning economic unit. Yeah, so we can look at big ones and small ones and look for patterns. So those are the 3 project type stuff that we've got going on with regards to this development theory, which brings me to, again, where I think that ASU can stand out here, because yeah, and it has to do with considering economies as ecosystems and then pulling a lot of analogies about how an economy would work or could work from how an ecosystem works. So we're working on this project right now. We've got a series of postulates that we're noodling around with, trying to figure out whether or not this is something that is supportable. How would we figure out whether it's valid? Is it framed correctly? For example, what is energy in an economy? Is it the money? Is money a collection of energy? Is it a unit of storage of energy, kind of like a molecule? So these are the kinds of questions that we're playing with. But it would underpin the theory generation that we are working with in this area in particular about development theory. Okay, any questions?
Not at this point. The Q&A is quiet so far.
Okay, good. All right. So yeah, now it's I really wanted to have some time for discussion. So we yeah, so essentially, what is complexity economics? Why is it important for global futures? And what are we doing with it here at ASU? Okay, so I'm of the opinion at this point that complexity economics is not another box on that heterodox puzzle. For me, it is a fundamental reframing of how we consider economics. So this diagram that I have put here is an early instantiation of defining the themes in the School of Complex Adaptive Systems. So I think it's evolved, but this is the version that I have. All right, so we're looking at complexity in terms of SCAS being defined by the space created by these axes. Okay, so you have an adaptation axis. So because the world is always changing, beings are having to constantly adapt. And so they can, if they do adapt, they innovate. If they don't adapt, they fail. So this is something that Manfred referred to our last meeting where he's talking about success or failure. That would be that axis. And then you also have what we call, or what we can call the historical axis, which means that there is the time element is very important. So you are looking at things along the past and along the future. And then you have this third axis, which we call the interdependence axis, which is can run all the way from simple to complex. So you can think about this as individual, society, single cell, multi-cell, just as, so as a collection becomes more and more interconnected, it would move along this axis. Okay, so really when you start thinking about economic questions in terms of this space, we can, yeah, we actually will think about some things a little bit differently. So if you remember the framing of economics that we had on the second slide about the boxes, the heterodox boxes, they had put things in terms of scarcity, uncertainty, dominance, and change. So the way I'm thinking about these things now is that, yeah, well, instead of scarcity, what we're really interested in are boundaries. And all of these terms are broadly and need to be understood broadly. So we talk about planetary boundaries. We can also talk about the boundaries and the limits within a dynamical system of any kind. But instead of scarcity, scarcity implies that there is a constraint. But instead of seeing the constraint as scarcity, we can see this constraint simply as natural boundaries that occur in any sort of system. All right, so instead of uncertainty, we're stuck with uncertainty. I don't think that goes anywhere. But we can understand it more broadly in terms of, I'm just not sure what the price of that stock is going to be, the uncertainty, or I don't know what the weather's going to be next week. The uncertainty might be more along, I don't know how somebody's going to behave. So we kind of drive that uncertainty into more of a behavioral level. Okay, so dominance, yeah, I'm rethinking this one in terms of cooperation. And this might be better said as cooperation and competition. So I think we've had some really interesting discussions about this, but certainly when you're talking about a maximizing individual, that maximizing individual is by nature of being a maximizing individual with scarce resources, that individual is involved in competition. And I think neoclassical economics has always been framed in terms of competitive structures and competition. Now, there is a place for competition. Competition happens. However, one of the things that we get from looking at economies as ecosystems is that really ecosystems have some competition, but they're really about cooperation and symbiosis. So that brings out a lot of those concepts and ideas that we can apply to economic questions of like, okay, where is the cooperation here? So for example, if you're looking at how a city or town develops and wants to develop or grow, because they're not necessarily the same thing, economically or for well-being or whatever measure you want to use, there will be, we do suspect that there's going to be a complexification process where you need these sorts of industries and tasks going on, and then you can build other industries and tasks on top of that. So for example, if you remember, or if you have seen Nomadland with Frances McDermott, it's about Empire, Nevada, which basically was where US Gypsum was. And that whole town was founded around US Gypsum. So that was there. And then you had the gas stations, the schools, the libraries, the swimming pools, whatever, that were there to support the people who were working for that company. So when that company failed, there was absolutely nothing left in that community to restart or revive that economy. I mean, the economy basically left. It just went away. And so everybody left and they went away. And so there's rows of tract houses that are just completely empty because there's nothing going on there. Right, so there's a couple of definitions that have come out of Santa Fe Institute work around what exactly is an economy. So some people think it's a way to solve problems and that a market economy, a capitalist market economy, is a really good way to get the best solutions for the problem, and the competition comes around with whose solution is best. I'm not sure that's completely accurate because it's hard to imagine what problem Facebook was solving, for example. But another way to think about it is an economy is a way that we as individuals cooperate in order to meet our needs, both basic and aspirational. There was a conference a couple of weeks ago, which was very interesting if anybody caught up with it, CORE. So I think it was, not going to remember. It was a religion and ethics and science, conference on religion and ethics and science. That's what it was. And some of the panelists were really interesting. I mean, so Russ Roberts, if you were familiar with him, he runs Econo Talk for the last 15 years or so. He was on it, and it's like the understanding is that with the fall of man, we were required to work. So whether you buy the narrative or the myth or not, the idea is that being a being on this planet, we are required to work to meet our needs, and that the economy is actually a result of us cooperating in order to meet the needs. So that not everybody needs to go grow their own food, make their own clothes, etc. That we actually do this through cooperation. So I would say that it's cooperation that is fundamental to an economy rather than competition. And I'm sure I would love to hear comments on that perspective. Okay, and then finally, the last bit of framing from the original slide that we saw was around change. Okay, and so this I would rethink in terms of evolution, and this would be more of an extended evolutionary concept, where you've got niche creation, you have agents' behavior that is represented in environmental changes, and those environmental changes therefore change the agent's decisions, and there's this constant back and forth. So we call that the internalization, externalization process. Okay, so that's pretty much what I have for you. And then I just want to end with, we could really use some students. Ideally, we would use students that know math and can code, but we have so many different projects that they don't even need to know math and be able to write code. We have a very ambitious agenda. Shade's got a hit, you'll hear from Shade at some point. He's a member of the Complexity Economics Lab, so he's very much involved in that economic development program that I was explaining. Yeah, so we have a lot to do, and we could carry a lot of students along and teach them very interesting things. Okay, so I'm ready to turn over to questions.
Well, thanks, Joffa, for this very concise and fascinating overview. We have already one question by Alex Danvers. To what extent the description of cooperation in ecosystems is related to multi-level selection?
That's a very good question. No, I'm not being facetious. It actually is a very good question. It's one of the things that we are looking at. And again, it's really interesting for us, the ecological ecosystem analogies, because now we can start thinking about that in terms of multi-level selection. And we actually have had some conversations about just that question. I don't know, does cooperation, it could. Yeah.
Well, if I may briefly jump in here, I think this is really a fundamental question. It's also a fundamental question about the focus of what actually are the ultimate mechanisms one needs to understand a particular phenomenon. What multi-level selection theory allowed us to do is to see that there are nested processes of selection that might create both, that drive a system can drive a system in the same direction as well as in different directions, which creates some conflict that then needs to be resolved. And often as a consequence of that conflict, new regulatory structures emerge that then become the dominant explanation for the whole system behavior. So it's as Joffa said, it's important to keep that in mind, and it is an unresolved question, but one that we are actively pursuing. So Joffa Shade asks, how do you differentiate between cooperation and coordination?
I don't. I mean, we can talk about that. I mean, you need to cooperate to coordinate, I would assume, especially if you are agents. This is actually a very interesting topic. So another thing going on at SFI, and if I remember correctly, I believe that Brian is going to be talking about this coming up, is the idea of collective action, right? So you have a series of agents that are, even maybe they're not like consciously cooperating, but yeah, they actually evolve as a collective group in various directions. So that's certainly tied into this question, Shade, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Brian has to say about that.
Okay, are there any other questions? As you know, we need to have this Q&A because that's how it's set up as the webinar. So you can't just jump in and everybody talk, even though we would prefer that.
Yeah, and this topic in particular, I mean, I think what's fun, why it's so much fun to talk about economic issues is that everybody has an understanding of it. It's like an intuitive thing because everybody has an experience of it. So I think it's, yeah, it's ripe for very good informative discussion.
Any other questions?
It doesn't look like it.
Well, if it doesn't look like it, we are close to the hour anyway. So then let us thank Joffa again for this great overview. And I'm sure questions will come either by electronic communication or hopefully relatively soon in person when we all can get back.
Mm-hmm.
And a reminder, the next talk is in 2 weeks. You will get the announcements. And so with that, everybody gets to stretch for 5 minutes before the next Zoom meeting.
Okay,
which is an important etiquette that we should develop in this world.
Yep. All right. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, everybody.